Okay, great. So Seth, go ahead.
Okay. So this is going to be a talk about long-term thinking. I'll explain the background. I'll talk about myself. But I will have this emphasis on how the Japanese engaged in long-term thinking and saved Japan's civilization from collapsing. It was a very, very interesting thing what happened there, and lessons to be learned from that. So my symbolism here on this first slide, the marshmallow and the acorn, is to acknowledge that humans, Homo sapiens, sometime a long, long time ago, very long time ago, a Homo sapiens decided to plant an acorn instead of eating it. That indicated that our species was capable of thinking for the long term, and that the idea of planting something, taking an action which would not pay off for quite a few years, made sense and was something that somebody deliberately. The marshmallow, on the other hand, symbolizes short-term thinking. And I'll talk about the marshmallow test and explain how that connects into short-term thinking. So this is, I'm going to start with a bit of my background and see if I can remember how to change slides. Good. I find it's useful to organize my life in these three levels. My life and education at the bottom, my work life, and then my volunteering life. Volunteering turned out to be very, very important to me. And so I have that as a separate category. And this is what my life looks like in terms of logos. So to get started, on the lower left, my father was a diplomat, and so I grew up in quite a few countries. By the age of 23, I'd lived in 5 countries, 1 protectorate, which was Okinawa, Japan, now Japan, but it wasn't at that time, 4 states in the United States and Washington, D.C. So I moved around a lot as a kid up to the age of 23, and then I sort of stabilized in the United States for a long time. And then going further, looking to the right, I'm now in Italy. In the year 2001, I bought a piece of property here, and that's where I am at the moment. And then in 2009, I moved to Kyrgyzstan and spent 14 years in Kyrgyzstan. I've now retired. You can see up above there. Can you see my cursor, by the way, if I put the cursor there?
Yep.
So up there, you can see I ended up at Outsa and then decided to retire. And I'm now splitting my time between Italy and San Francisco in the United States. Jumping back, after college, I majored in psychology and political science. I joined the Peace Corps, so I started my volunteering career. And I was a volunteer in Nepal. And after I came back, I went to Stanford Business School, and then a couple of years later joined Hewlett-Packard, worked there for 20 years, and started doing a lot of volunteer activities. This is the alumni consulting teams. This is Joint Venture Silicon Valley. And I created a really important, with a lot of other people, NGO called Smart Valley. And that was all about getting the internet started. And that was took up a huge amount of my time, over 5 years concentrated, but that was purely as a volunteer job. I had other work at the same time. I formed my own consulting company and ended up rejoining the Peace Corps to go to Kyrgyzstan and become the country director there. So that time I was paid. I was no longer a volunteer. After the Peace Corps in Bishkek, I joined Outsa, taught first in the business program, in the MBA program, and then moved to anthropology, now LAS, to do urban planning studies. So that's kind of an overview of my life. When you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it looks kind of messy. It is. Did a lot of different stuff and really had a good time. Enjoyed my life and continue to enjoy my life quite a lot. So that's my background. The talk, I'm going to start with what is long-term thinking, and then we're going to start going into some elements and methods for learning how to do long-term thinking, including deep time, what is it, how our brain works, why long-term thinking is important, and then the case study on cathedral thinking, which the Japanese did in the Tokugawa era in the 1700s. And a little bit about indigenous systems, which relates to Kyrgyzstan. Most of this talk is based on two books, The Good Ancestor by Roman Krznaric, which is all about methods of thinking about long term, and then a book called Collapse, which I have here by Jared Diamond, and it is actually about why do civilizations collapse. It's quite a large, but once I started reading it, I found it fascinating and I loved it. So a lot of the material comes from that, also my own experience and other readings. In fact, here are my inspirations. When I was in college, I read a book called The Limits to Growth. It was all about how we are on a trajectory consuming materials that are not replaceable. And what does that mean? And it was a very, very interesting book. They have updated it since then, and it basically shows that their predictions were pretty much on track. However, it was extremely controversial. A lot of people say it's a waste of time. Another book that was very influential is The Art of the Long View. It's about scenario planning. In about 2000, I joined the Long Now Foundation. On the right is the symbol of the Long Now Foundation, which is a clock that's designed to run for 10,000 years and keep accurate time. So you can imagine the challenge of building a mechanical device that would last for 10,000 years. And so there's been a lot of people involved in the thinking about this problem. You can go to the website and learn more about it, but they do a lot of other things. And I know some of the founders personally. Tuscany versus Silicon Valley. So in the year 2001, I bought my apartment in on the left in this old farm building. They think it's on the order of 1,000 years old. So I have this connection to the past in Tuscany. When I look at the walls of my apartment and I see stones that have been in place for 1,000 years, it's pretty amazing in looking at the view and everything else. On the right-hand side, though, I'm part of Silicon Valley, which is all about the future. And so I'm constantly going back and forth between these two worlds. Collapse, I mentioned. In 2019, I toured Greece and I saw the collapsed civilizations. It was very, very interesting in the Greek islands to see how these civilizations had failed for one reason or another, sometimes by attacks or an earthquake. I'm sorry, a volcano blew up, Santorini, and just wiped out cities all around the Mediterranean. And then the Good Ancestor book. So these are my inspirations, and I encourage you to look into these references. And I have links at the end of this. When you get the slide presentation, you can follow up on some of this. What is long-term thinking? This is a picture of, it's a painting actually, of a bristlecone pine tree in California. The bristlecone pine is believed to be one of the longest lived species of trees in the world. And this particular one is one of the oldest that they found so far. They believe it's 4,854 years old. So a single organism has survived for 4,854 years. It's pretty incredible. The location of it is hidden. It's secret. They want to protect it from people who want to go see it and damage it. And so it's. So I want you to take a minute and put in the chat a few words about what is time for you. What does time mean to you? And you could also suggest a shape, a drawing, an image of time. So why don't you think for a minute and then put a few thoughts into the chat, and let's see how each of you views time. A lot of silence. Time is a blessing. It's shaped like this tree, in my point of view. Does that mean it's kind of messy? It grows in different directions?
Well,
Mirzo.
in my opinion, if we connect it to physics, there is a possibility that our universe is one of many universes, and if we take that into consideration, each how to say it in English, that tree part which is grown,
The trunk of the tree.
yes, each trunk of the tree might be each universe, and
The branches, sorry.
yeah,
The branches.
branches.
I
Yeah.
see, okay. Some other thoughts on what time means to you? Watch out, Yumi, I'm going to ask you to talk about it. Time is something individual, like personal, Amanda? It's a personal thing? Time for me is moments. Circle for me would be representation of time, okay? Personal, yes, okay, Amanda. Like everyone has their own thought on what is time. And that's when I do this exercise, I'm really surprised at how many ways people have to think about time. I always thought everybody thought about time like I do, which is I think there's never enough, and I'm always running out of time, and that's kind of a frustrating thing. It's very limited, but I'll come back to that. All right. Aliyah, time for me is like a person who always walks next to us. Sometimes he is in such a hurry and runs very fast. Sometimes it is a calm and even lazy person who stands still and does not move. Wow. I really like that. Very, very visual representation of time. Thank you, Aliyah. One more. All right, Yumi, you want to throw in your feelings about time? You're muted.
Professor, your microphone is muted.
Yeah, sorry. I was copy and pasting Arias because I was also impressed. But time is, we think time is infinite. And for sometimes time is like forever, but time is just a moment. And this time also together with how many people? 22 to 21 people. It will never happen. So for me, time is precious and special. And time is something that only once, but from a different perspective, forever.
Good. Very nice. It's complicated.
Yeah, it is.
You're bringing in physics in where it goes and what happens to time. Okay. So let's, here is how I have been drawing time. I took the Kyrgyz tradition of petroglyphs, And you may recognize this one, that I'm seeing time as a spiral. And one reason why I like the spiral metaphor is you can think of the spiral going forward or going backwards. And so there is long-term time behind us and long-term time ahead of us. And then the dots around the spiral represent 7 generations. And I'll come back and talk more about 7-generation thinking. And again, it's 7 generations backwards as well as thinking forward 7 generations. So this is my graphic for time. Now we're going to go into deep time thinking, which is one of the mindsets that comes from the Good Ancestor book. There are 6 mindsets, which I will identify shortly. But deep time thinking is really fun and interesting, and it really is humbling when we realize what a tiny moment in time we are in, sort of what Yumi was talking about. So our time on this planet has been very, very brief. So here's some questions to put that in perspective. Anybody know how old the universe is? Our universe, the current one, Mirzo, that we're experiencing at the moment?
13 billion years, if I'm not mistaken.
13.8 billion years, yes. 13.8 billion years. How old is the Earth?
It's from 3 to 5, if I'm not mistaken.
3.8, coincidentally. So the universe has been around for 13.8, 10 billion years longer than the Earth was around. So the universe existed for 10 billion years before the Earth came together. How long have there been humanoids? Not Homo sapiens, but versions of different kinds of humans.
From 1 million years to 6 million years?
About 2 million years. You're really good at this, Mirza. This is good. The modern Homo sapiens brain is about only 100,000 years old. So it's pretty recent in the evolution of hominids. And settlements didn't appear until around 11,500 years ago. And cities didn't appear until around 9,000 years. Before that, though, there was a significant period of agrarian communities. So we have only really been, civilized in the sense of living together with each other for about 11,500 years. And how long will it be until our sun dies? So looking forward, so we've gone back 13 billion years. How far forward will our universe survive based on the laws of physics?
I don't remember exactly, but it's few billion years there were for sun to die.
About 5 billion years. However, the Earth will have been consumed by the expanding sun long before that. So maybe we only really have 2 to 3 billion years before our planet is no longer habitable. So if our species is to survive, we're going to have to find another solar system to move to. We can stay in our galaxy, but we're going to have to find another planet somewhere in our galaxy to keep the Homo sapiens species going. So this gives us a sense of we here now have just arrived, and we still have a long time to go, but not infinite. That eventually probably most likely going to just disappear along with the solar system. Another way of looking at this is this spiral going way back in the lower left to the beginning of the Earth to where we are today. It's a little bit hard to read this, I know, but this is where the dinosaurs were up here. And they were wiped out 65 million years ago by the earth hit the earth. So some mammals existed at that time and they managed to survive and life continued. But it wasn't until very, very recently, the Quaternary period, where humans and humanoids were getting together. And 11,500 years ago here is where humans were actually living in settlements. So you go way back here and you get back to the time when there was no life on land. There was only life in the water, and life in the water existed for billions of years. Well, what is that? I can't quite read that. 1 EX a year? Long time ago, 2 billion years, way, way back. So we're in this incredible spiral, but we are just a tiny, tiny piece of the timeline of the earth and life. So we have developed very unique brain. Here, as near as we can tell, we are the only species that is capable of planning both short-term and long-term. Lots of species are capable of short-term planning, but we seem to be unique in our ability to think long-term, literally hundreds of years into the future. And this, our brain is designed for this. We are capable of jumping between thinking in terms of seconds, as in our cell phones constantly beeping at us, minutes, planning ahead for traffic, getting to work. Sorry? Imat, can you mute yourself, please? Imat?
Zoom hosts. Zoom
there.
hosts can mute
Got it.
automatically.
Right. So we can jump back and forth in terms of our thinking. We are capable of thinking in terms of centuries. Building a cathedral, 7 generations, planting an oak tree. But we're much more comfortable in the middle range here. And few people can think much beyond 10, 15 years. This Long Now Foundation that I belong to, it thinks in terms of 10,000 years. So what are we going to be, what is our current impact on the next 10,000 years? And a lot of time is spent looking back 10,000 years to when civilization began, and what can we learn from the past and apply it forward. So the people involved closely into the long-term thinking movement, 10,000 years is something that they try to think about routinely. In fact, when they write dates like 2024, they start with 02/024 to indicate 10,000 year calendar. And we're in the first digit, 4 digits. We've still got a long ways to go to get to 1. So we have this brain that works this way, and it's really quite remarkable. However, we are more comfortable thinking short term. And this is a very, very interesting experiment about how the brain works. That's very famous in psychology world. It's called the marshmallow test. And back in the 1960s, some researchers did this experiment where they took kids around the age of 5, I think it was, when the brain is at a certain stage of its development. And they offered them the opportunity to get 2 marshmallows if they could wait for 15 minutes. Otherwise, they could take the 1 marshmallow that was sitting there in front of them. And then the researcher would leave the room and the child would sit there. They would video record what the child did and whether or not the child ate the mushroom. And obviously, you can take one now and satisfy yourself, and maybe at that. But if you can wait, you get a bonus. You get 2 marshmallows. So what do you think happened? How many kids do you think were able to wait the 15 minutes and get the second marshmallow? Anybody want to just, you can turn on your mic and just throw out a number. What percentage of the kids were able to defer gratification? Do you think with this experiment? Oh, I'm not seeing where I gotta get. Hey, Yumi, can you see the chat? I'm not looking.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat. Nobody is throwing numbers.
Oh, here we go.
So would you like to probably repeat a question again about marshmallow?
What do you think, what percentage of the kids were able to defer, to wait 15 minutes and not eat the first marshmallow right away? 70% were able to wait, says, sorry, Hakimov?
Yeah, you can say sure. Sure.
Any other guesses? 20% were able to defer, says Aliyah. Yumi guesses 30, Raim 30. One more. No more. So Raim are correct. The first time they did this experiment, they found that 30% of the kids were able to defer, 70% were not. So the interesting question was, what differentiated these kids? Why was it that some of them were able to wait? And the researcher behind this, his name is Michel. He was fascinated by this idea that some of these kids were able to wait. And so he did a lot of research and he did longitudinal study. And he found that the kids who were able to wait for the second marshmallow did better in school and they did better in life. And this was very, very surprising. But what he concluded was that delayed gratification was teachable, where longer term thinking was teachable, and it was worth teaching because those who were able to wait were able to have a better life. They did better in life in general. So he dedicated his life to helping teachers teach the skills of delayed gratification in thinking longer term. And what they've found is, in fact, that over time, more and more kids are able to think longer term. But he also asked the question of what was different about these kids. And what he, I don't have it on the slide here, but what he found was that the kids who were able to defer came from households that were wealthier, more stable, in a secure environment. In other words, the kids were ready to trust, and they trusted the research to actually fulfill their promise. And so they came from a supportive environment that allowed them to take a chance and take a risk. And this is very important when we think about our species, and what we're doing now is how do we build an environment where people will trust their leaders, trust in plans for the future, and have confidence that planning for the future will actually make a difference. And this will be illustrated in the Tokugawa example of forest management. So we'll come back to this. So it's very, very interesting learnings that came out of this experiment. And this experiment is very famous. You will see it referred to in many different occasions. So we have these two brains. Our ancient lizard brain developed over 500 million years. It's a very, very ancient thing, and we've added components to our brain over time, but it's fundamentally driven by stimulus response, fight or flight. When we see a stranger on the horizon, do we prepare to fight or do we run away? We have to make those decisions quickly. We also have the pain system to motivate us and help us make decisions quickly. But the prefrontal cortex, which is in the front, developed later in the evolution of the brain. And there's some thinking that this may have been an invention actually of women, because women were given the job of raising the children. And when a child was very small, the child's grandmother in ancient times was responsible for teaching the child how to survive, because our children are incredibly weak and helpless for a very long time. And they need to learn lots of skills. They need to know how to find food in the forest. They need to know how to stay out of trouble. They need to know what to do if you see a lion, and how to handle all kinds of things. And so it's this long-term childhood and survival skills that were so important that may have been that allowed us to develop this planning brain. Now, the hunters, the males, also needed to plan. They needed to coordinate their actions and learn from past hunting expeditions so that they knew where the animals would be at certain times of the year, in the phases of the moon and all this kind of stuff. So there are quite a few reasons that we develop long-term thinking that enable us as a species to survive and do better. But really, we don't fundamentally know how these kinds of things happen. But these are theories. So nonetheless, we have this second brain, the acorn brain, but the science shows that only about 14% of the time are we thinking about more than 1 year, further out than 1 year. Most of our energy is involved in shorter term thinking. There's this author, Daniel Gilbert, says we are unique in that we are the ape that is able to look forward. Other species, they're on an annual cycle, and many of them, of course, much, much shorter than that. So they're under pressure a lot to think quickly, to make decisions quickly, a lot of pressure. We're constantly being stimulated by electronic devices now. More and more people are distracted by sounds and vibrations, interruptions. We are being pulled into the short term all the time. And we all know time is money, and, get rich quick. Or we're really interested in making as much money as fast as we can. And there's lots of people telling us this is the right thing to do, move fast. But that's not necessarily what's right and best for our species, for our survival. So to sort of wrap up this idea and your comments about what is time, as Yumi said, we are always in the now. We are here now. 1 second ago, every word that I just said, we can't go back and look at that again. It will never happen again. As Yumi said, we can't repeat the past. We are constantly moving forward. But how we remember the past, very interestingly, is constantly changing. People are constantly writing histories and erasing people from history, or adding things into history and making up memories and making up stories. And so the past is very, very dynamic in terms of how we see it and understand it. But the future, we don't know. And we can do all the planning we want, but it's very complicated. We have the laws of physics, which allow us to plan certain things very, very accurately. And what's happening now with climate change is the scientists are able to make lots and lots of predictions about the future. But it's a very complex world, and lots of things are unpredictable. And if you're seeing the data about the warming of the oceans, the data in the last year and so far in this year are off the charts, literally. And that was totally unexpected by the scientists. And they're madly trying to figure out why the last year and so far this year, the oceans have been warming at a much, much higher rate. So predictions, we've got a lot to learn still on that. Okay. So why, let me just quickly take a pause here. Does anybody have any questions they want to put in chat or a comment? We can, I know I'm never going to make it on time, but anyway, if you have a thought or a question on this, you can turn your mic off, on, or put something in chat.
There is a comment I want to comment, and I want to say that the average human life is 70 years. So for us, it is not really beneficial. For each individual, it is not really beneficial to think for a long term, since we will not face that long term.
What about your children?
Well, I can do something for my children, and then my children will do something for their children. And after I die, the all which is left is my generation's problems. And I won't be able to help them anyhow.
But you do care about how your actions affect your children, even though you don't have any children yet. You do care about your children and maybe your grandchildren at this point? Not sure.
Depends. Well, it depends. Everything depends. Since things might change really fast. So there is a chance I will have no children, or there is a chance the world will blow up yet tomorrow. So
yes,
depending on that chancing and each day life, we plan to do certain things. Although there is also a chance to just plant tree outside of AUCA there and wait for 50 years to grow up. And that is also possible. Maybe it will grow up in those 50 years, maybe it will not, and will die in the next winter.
Yep, very true. Lots of uncertainties. But let me throw you another way of thinking about this problem, which is the kinds of things that you may be doing today without thinking about it that affect your children's, grandchildren's, great-grandchildren's future. And one example I like to use is a plastic water bottle. You have a choice with that plastic water bottle. Do you throw it away in the trash or do you recycle it? If you throw it away, it will be in the environment for at least the next 200 years. So that's an action that you're taking that has an impact on 200 years into the future, because that plastic isn't going anywhere. And there are many other things, examples like that. For example, CO2 into the atmosphere. CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for 200 years. So it's kind of crazy to think about it, but every time you exhale, you are adding CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's going to be breathed by your great-great-great-great-grandchildren. So there are things we're doing consciously for the past and for the future, and things we are doing unconsciously. And we need to be aware of what we are doing unconsciously, as well as taking action for the future. Great. Thank you, Mirza, for those perspectives. Hopefully the rest of this talk will help convince all of you that you do make a difference, and you can be proactive about it. So our competing brains, quick reaction, the marshmallow, short-term gratification, buy now, We have addictions, we have dopamine, we want the pleasure stimulus. On the other hand, we know to save seeds for the future, to plant them if we want to eat in the future, if we want acorns, if we want fruits and vegetables. We need long-term thinking. Farmers are very good at thinking decades in the future. We reuse, we recycle, we can think about, we have empathy for we are capable of thinking about the possibility of children and how they would live. You can build a supply chain, and that will last a long time, much longer than you. Learn a skill, plan a family. There are many things we can do every day in our lives that affect the long-term future. Daniel Gilbert, again, has this quote, the problem is when it comes to long-term thinking, we don't do it very well, and we need to be better at it. So Roman Krznaric has done this amazing job of breaking down this very complex problem into the concept of mindsets. And he offers 6 mindsets for thinking about the future. And on the left side of the screen, you see 6 mindsets for thinking about the short term. So we have the clock, a very recent invention in terms of long-term thinking that has really put a lot of pressure on us to think short term. Try to imagine life, what it would be like if we didn't have clocks, and you could show up for class whenever you thought it was the right time to show up for class, and what life would be like in that era. Capitalism is another driver. The sooner you get your money, the more money you make. Progress is another driver for short-term thinking. But the 6 ways of thinking long-term, we've just been talking about deep time humility. The legacy mindset is about what are we leaving to our descendants. Intergenerational justice is what rights should our descendants have to a better life. Cathedral thinking is about long-term thinking, building projects that last, that you probably will not see finished in your own lifetime. Holistic forecasting is trying to pull together different scenarios of where we're going in the future, where we might go. And the transcendent goal is how humanity can come together and unite on different visions of the future for humanity. I'm going to talk about the first 4, but only briefly. I strongly recommend the book because I think the book is really fantastic. And he does a wonderful job with these things. So long-term thinking allows us to plan complicated projects and understand and address major problems like climate change and sustainability. It helps us prepare for emergencies, things that never happened before, floods, earthquakes, get us ready for that so we can respond. And long-term thinking also helps give us purpose and meaning in life. If we think about, for example, there are many things, but what our mission in life may be to leave the world a better place for our descendants. So that's our purpose and gives us reason to move forward even though life is hard. Our actions today have consequences for future generations. If we plant a forest, plant trees, we could convert CO2 for hundreds of years into oxygen. That trees will survive a long time if we plant a good forest. If we consume non-renewable resources like oil and copper and many other minerals, there will be less available of those substances for future generations. As we discard our waste into rivers, into forests, into the air, our health suffers, other species suffers, other species are dying at a very high rate these days. We do have an impact with our actions. And you can think of short-term thinking as leading to a theft, the stealing of quality of life from future generations. And I'm not sure where it comes in. a wonderful quote from Greta Thunberg about this subject, about stealing the future. So how long do you think civilizations last? And let's not worry too much about the definition of civilization. Just think about, you know, the Roman civilization, the Greek civilization, the Genghis Khan civilization, Chinese civilization. How long do you think the average lifespan is of a civilization? The chat isn't working out very well. If you wish to put something in the chat, but just make it, you can make notes. 3 generations. All right.
100
Got
years.
how many years old?
Is it 1,000 years?
1,000 years. The typical, the
1,000.
average civilization lasts 1,000 years. All right. So here is a map showing the length of, I don't know, this is maybe 60, 70 civilizations over time, going back to ancient Egypt, Carthage, classical Greek, Roman, the Roman civilization, and how long they lasted. And the answer to the question is 336 years. On average, civilizations have lasted 336 years. That's not a lot of time when you think about it. And when you think about our current civilization, which you might describe as something that's industrialized, huge command over energy, human capitalism, democracy, and all that kind of stuff. We've been working in this world for only a couple hundred years, and maybe even less, 150. So we have at least another, on average anyway, hopefully 100 years, but maybe not. Something could happen. So civilization fragile. We tend to think that they are there forever when we're living in them, but looking back, we see that doesn't work that well. And the book Collapse is about why do civilizations collapse, and it has a lot of case studies, of which we'll talk about Tokugawa. This chart is a very, very interesting chart about where we are and where we're going. This is a chart called the Great Acceleration, and it takes about 10 variables and looks at what's been happening since the year 1750. So if you take, for example, the purple line here, this is population. So this is the growth of population over this time. And you can see that starting around 1900, 1950, population has been growing up more rapidly. You see temperature of the Earth here, and this is change in temperature going up. Species, loss of species, the number of species in decline has been increasing. Energy consumption increasing rapidly. GDP has taken off. Transportation. The one that's coming down is ozone, the pink one over here on the right. You can see it shoots up here, and I mean, almost straight up. This is the ozone hole appearing over the Antarctica, and then suddenly it turns down. That's because we, as a civilization, global civilization, stopped putting chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, or at least dramatically reduced it, and now the ozone hole is healing itself. But all the others are going up, and the rate at which they're going up is getting faster and faster. So this is a very, very interesting snapshot of what's going on. And I would like to point out this very important and interesting data point here is you can see that right around 1950, population and other things started changing at a more rapid rate. Can any of you think of what's an important thing that happened around 1950? Yumi knows the answer to this.
End of war, maybe?
End of the war. End of World War II, yes. And what happened immediately after the end of the war?
World war between countries.
So after the war, something very important happened. I was born. I was born in 1949.
I think it started like the industrialization in the US, like it's a rise up maybe.
Didn't what start? Amanda, could you repeat that?
Industrialization.
Industrialization started actually in the 1800s. Back here around 1850 is where industrializations got started, right around here. But I think you're probably thinking of something that's very close, which is the baby boom. After the war, the United States, Europe, all over the world, there was an explosion of babies. I'm one of them, and my brothers and sisters too. And this is another reason why I think one of the drivers behind many of these lines is there's a lot more people on the planet now. Can you guess, well, again, do you know how many people are on the planet now? We passed a milestone last year, I believe it was. Mirzo, you're really good at this.
8 billion. No.
8 billion people. How many people were on the planet when I was born? That's a harder one for Mirzo.
I guess it was 2 billion. No?
Man, good. 2.5. So in my lifetime, we have gone from 2.5 billion people to 8 billion people. Try to imagine how I see the world when I walk around in a city and how many people there are, how big the city is, and where did all these people come from? It's really mind-boggling what I have seen in my very, very short lifespan. So it's amazing. That keeps me humble. Greta has this, she's really amazing in the way she makes very clear points in her speeches. I'm going to read these quotes to you. These was a speech at COP 24, so it was about 2018. So she's addressing the audience at COP, but you can think of yourself as the audience and Greta speaking to you too in this speech. In the year 2078, I will celebrate my 78th birthday. If I have children, then maybe they will spend the day with me. And maybe they will ask about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there was still time to act. Of course, she's referring to climate change. So maybe they will ask, why didn't you do anything when you knew there was a problem? In fact, I knew there was a problem when I was in college in the 1970s. We were starting to talk about this then. Then she says, you say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their eyes. By inaction, by doing nothing about climate change, you are taking your children's future away from them. This is a very profound thought. Greta is uniquely capable of long-term thinking and thinking about what are the implications of what's going on here? What are we doing to ourselves? So I really like her thinking. All right, I am way out of time, so I'm going to now start moving much faster, but I am going to cover the Tokugawa case study. So this is a case study in cathedral thinking. How Tokugawa had to learn how to manage their forests to prevent the collapse of Japanese civilization. So in 1603, the Tokugawa Shogunate took over. The emperor gave his blessing to, I think it was, I'm not sure, Yumi might correct me, to Ieyasu Tokugawa as the first shogun. And over the next 10, 20 years, the country was closed to foreigners. The Christians were expelled. There was peace after hundreds of years of war, of the, I can't remember, the barons. There were dozens of them around the country, and they were constantly fighting with each other. And for the first time in hundreds of years, there was peace. Very, very quickly, population doubled in 100 years. The size of the population doubled. How fast has our population gone up? We've gone from 2.5 to 8. That's almost tripled in my 75 years. Tripled. They doubled. Okay. They moved the capital to Edo. A lot of urbanization. The economy grew rapidly. The merchant class grew, and Edo became the world's most populous city in 1720. It was the biggest city in the entire world. So this was an incredible period of time, 200 years under the Tokugawa, where there was peace and strong economy. And on the right, you see the map. Hokkaido in the north did not belong to Japan, did not belong to the shogun, but it was a trading partner. The Ainu people there, it was an important trading partner. But the islands, and I don't think the Ryukyus were involved, but the other major islands were considered to be part of Japan. Wood was a critical resource for the economy and the well-being of the people of Japan. Most of the buildings were made of wood. They liked wood. It's beautiful. And it was very comfortable and easy and readily available, easy to work and shape it. It was also very important for energy. It was their primary source of energy. If you wanted to make a samurai sword, you had to use a lot of wood, and you had to heat it up to melt the metal. But it was for cooking, industry, all kinds of purposes. Ships were made out of wood, and they made a lot of ships, and they tried to conquer Korea. And that was a lot of warships. Urban housing with urbanization grew very rapidly, and cities would expand, and then there would be a fire, and then they would rebuild, and they would need more trees. The shoguns and the daimyo, Yumi, correct, how do you pronounce daimyo?
Daimyo. Daimyo.
Daimyo. The daimyo, the next level down, of wooden castles, and they built a lot of them to show off wealth. 10 square miles of forest to build 3 castles, and 2 shoguns over time built 200 of these castles, consuming a vast amount of forest. Urban housing. The wood was also the forest were this major source of fertilizer and feed for the animals. That's the animals would eat leaves, branches, straw from rice. So it was really important. And you need 1 acre of cropland to support, 5 to 10 acres of forest to support 1 acre of agriculture. The daimyo also paid their taxes in the form of wood. So wood was a form of currency, and so you needed to have access to wood. So serious deforestation was already happening around Kyoto and Osaka in the south, the Kannai Basin, in the year 800. So deforestation was a serious problem long before the Tokugawa, but by 1000, it was happening in Shikoku Island, and by 1550, 1/4 of Japan had been completely deforested, just no trees left. And by the way, this was old growth. So these were old growth forests that were completely lost. Hideyoshi, building his castles, ordered timber from all over the islands, including from Hokkaido. And so sometimes they would go to Hokkaido and steal the forest from the Ainu, and would ship it down to Honshu. And by 1710, this is now well into the Tokugawa Shogunate, most of the accessible forests on the major islands had been cut down. It was looking pretty grim. The shoguns noticed more problems, arguments, fights, battles about fuel and animal fodder between the villages because there wasn't enough. The rivers were being cleared to make it easier to float logs down the rivers and destroying fishing habitats. So that was creating a major problem for the fishing people versus the forestry people. Wildfires would happen in new growth. Old growth, they survive fires much more easily. Soil erosion, the rivers were filling up with mud, siltation, loss of fertilizer, and there were famines in the late 1600s because they couldn't grow enough food because of deforestation. The shoguns woke up when it started to get really personal. They wanted to build more castles, and they couldn't get the wood, and it was getting more and more expensive and more difficult to get the wood. And then in 1657, much of Edo was destroyed in fire. And this was pretty horrifying. 100,000 people died in a single fire, which must have lasted quite a long time. They also noticed, I think, that there was an entrepreneur who said, oh my goodness, look at this opportunity. They're going to need a lot more wood. And so he went out and bought up lots of forests. And then he made and became extremely wealthy because he realized he had sort of medium-term thinking. Holy cow, we got to build more houses again. So let's capture the forests, and I can make a lot of money because they're going to be really valuable. So how do you solve such a huge problem? Cathedral mindset is this kind of thinking. You have to be able to think beyond your own lifespan to address a problem like this. So this cathedral here, you may know about it, is in Barcelona, Spain. It's Familia Sagrada, and it's not finished. It's almost, what is it, 100? It's 150 years now, I think. It's been 1882, yeah, 150 years. And they actually expect to finish it now in 2026. It was expected that it would be finished in 2021, and the pandemic happened, and so stop that. They couldn't make that any different. But Gaudi, and Antoni Gaudi, knew that he could not build this entire cathedral. So he laid out ground rules for how it could be finished. And his design principles allowed for other architects to come in and with a different design. And so what you see in the cathedral is different styles in different parts of the cathedral, but it's all harmonious. It's amazing how well this cathedral works, and you end up with something that's consistent but different and evolved over time. And of course, there was no money to build this thing at that time, but he created a mechanism for raising the money over time. And if you want the Familia Sagrada, you've got to pay a lot of money. The admission price is pretty steep, and that's how they help fund the construction. And they're philanthropists and the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So cathedral thinking includes making sure the project aligns with long-term societal needs. So thinking about Christians and needing, population would be growing, they would need another cathedral, brought it together, and thought about people and what they would want over the next several hundred years. Build a flexible and adaptable framework for how this place was to be built, transfer the knowledge from one architect to the next, to the next, to the next, from one construction company to the next, to the next. As new technologies were invented, new things could be developed, and so on. So cathedral thinking involves quite a few dimensions to help make sure that what you do is actually finished and it's consistent with the original intent. But you got to be flexible and be prepared for pandemics, which wasn't part of the plan. So how did the Japanese do this? How did the shoguns do this? They started out by inventorying their forests in extreme detail. They knew in each forest what type of trees there were, how many, where they were they straight, were they crooked, what was the species, and then they would identify which ones could be used for what purposes. So certain trees were low quality and suitable for maybe building a house. Other trees were suitable for decorations and for, making bowls and artwork in sculptures. And so they were strictly controlled and limited as to how many of these trees could be cut down versus those trees, who had the right to buy them, and so forth. They also studied the science of forestry and how fast do the trees grow in the different species and what kind of environments do they grow well in. They looked also at the rivers and the transportation systems and what was available. And they also diversified the energy system of the economy. They had more use of charcoal. They also went to whale oil. But it was hard. They didn't have coal. I forgot coal on this list. They did manage to get coal, but I don't think there's a whole lot of coal on the islands. They may have had to bring it in from other countries. But they had to understand the whole thing. So they started out by doing research to figure out what is the ecology, what is the system. Then they developed policies, rules, and regulations, and most important, enforcement. So the shogun had the power to hire police and make sure that wood did not move from one district to another district without proper paperwork and checking to make sure that they were authorized to move this particular kind of wood from here to there, so forth. So they also developed rules to reduce the amount of wood usage. If you are a low-level person, you get so many square meters. If you are shogun, you get so many square meters, different levels. So the size of the houses was regulated very strictly by your status. Population. They actually had a flat population for 100 years. No population growth. And that, of course, helped them manage there was no growth in consumption of firewood. They had to let the forest come back. Keeping the population stable was very, very important. Regulate everything, change the diet to include more seafood. So they developed new technologies, new kinds of nets to catch more fish. And they started doing more whaling and other kinds of things to bring in seafood so that the people were not so dependent on forest products for food. And they established trading relationships with the Ainu people. I'm not sure those were happy relationships. And in fact, that the Tokugawa regime was responsible for some degree to the rapid decline in Ainu civilization, but I'm not sure about that. Key third step is institutionalize the changes. So shoguns passed on what lessons learned and the research and the rules and the policies to their successors. They knew this was a multi-generational problem, and they needed the next generation kept the process going. They also created a profession that didn't exist before, which was forest management. And coincidentally, at the same time, starting in the 1500s, Germany developed forest management as a profession in science. And it spread out from Germany to the rest of Europe over the next couple hundred years. So there was a profession of people, scientists, managers, forest managers who were responsible for taking care of forests. And it was institutionalized in the government. So the government established, you follow the rules or you go to jail, you're fined, you lose your head, whatever. So that is work. And today, Japan, among first world countries, has the highest ratio of forested land to cities and agricultural land in the world. 20% of the land is all that's being used for people and agriculture. So on this map, which is dated 71, all the green areas are forests. And by the way, there are virtually no old growth forests left. Virtually everything is new, planted since the 1800s, 1700s. So highly, highly managed forests, but they've been very, very careful protecting their forests and controlling the land dedicated to agriculture and cities. So you have very dense cities in Japan, as hopefully, I hope some of you have been to Japan. By the way, Yumi and I both lived in Okinawa, so we have connection there. Okay, so I do have a few more minutes here, so I'm going to keep on going. Just to pause, this is one of the mindsets of long-term thinking, cathedral thinking. How do we plan long-term projects? Hopefully you personally, so many of you will be involved in long-term projects, one sort or another. Building a skyscraper, building a home, many, many things that we do are likely to outlive us. And we need to be thinking about what's in the best interest of our descendants, but not just our descendants. I mean, that's a little too selfish. It's also about our neighbors, our friends, our community, our nation. Right now, if you're in Bishkek, you may know about the water crisis that's now becoming more visible. And so the government has to put in new water systems, new water channels, which will hopefully last years, because water is essential in cities. In Bishkek, a growing water crisis, but the whole country does. So building that kind of infrastructure is another long-term thinking challenge that is very common among government. In government, it's really, really important. This is why long-term thinking is so important for politicians. But go into that subject. Okay, I wanted to bring up a few other approaches to long-term thinking. The first question I want you to briefly think about is, what is a generation? So there are different versions, different definitions of generation, and this photo illustrates the one that we use the most in the United States anyway. This is 4 generations in this photograph. So you have the great-grandmother, the grandmother, the mother, and the baby. 4 different generations. So a generation is basically thought of as the amount of time between a woman becoming, having a child, and that child being ready to have a child. So it used to be, 100, 150 years ago, maybe even further back than that, women were having children at 14 years old. Now, in modern Western societies, and increasingly in Kyrgyzstan, women are waiting and having their first child at the age of 25, 27, 28. And in the United States, now a lot of women are having their first child at 40. Like my nieces, both of my nieces, 2 of my nieces, both had their children at over the age of 40. So the concept of generation is broadening out time-wise. And by the way, this is what they did in Japan too, in Tokugawa era, is they had greater spacing between the children, and they had some forms of birth control and other techniques of encouraging people to not have so many kids and have them space them out further. So Iroquois actually have a different definition of a generation. They think of it as the lifespan of an individual. So on the order of 70, 75 years. These days, in the United States, I forget what it is, 72, 73, I think is sort of the average lifespan. So they think of one lifespan as being a generation. The Iroquois, though, are very interesting. It's an Native American tribe, and they take very, very seriously thinking forward 7 generations. So this chief of the Onondaga Nation, which is a branch of the Iroquois, has been given the job of being chief, and he got training from his predecessor in making sure that when the tribal council met and thought about major decisions, they had to take into account the impact 7 generations forward. So 7 generations forward, when you're thinking a generation is, let's say, maybe 60 years, that's 400 or 500 years. So every time they make a serious decision, they have to consider the needs of their descendants in 500 years. That's pretty amazing. The Maori in Polynesia, many of them, the ones that are around now these days, are in New Zealand, have a different concept. They think of themselves as being here and now, and as part of a continuum into the past and into the future. And they need to know their ancestors. And they also think very seriously about the importance of being a good ancestor to future generations. So they are very, very much into this. They have a special ability to think about the future and the implications of their actions. And they call this wakapaka. So it's very interesting. And of course, you have jetiata, the notion that everyone needs to memorize 7 generations, at least on the male side, of ancestors. Now, unfortunately, the purpose of jetiata is not about long-term thinking, but it does create an opportunity to institutionalize long-term thinking, building on this 7-generation tradition. But the purpose in Kyrgyzstan for having everyone memorize 7 generations back is to avoid intermarriage with a cousin, with a relative. If you go outside the tribe, you're okay. But if you marry inside the tribe, there is a risk of marrying someone that you're related to and having a child who has some defect. And so that's where this came from. How the ancient Kyrgyz people came up with this, I don't know, but it's very important. And I'm really glad to see this. And I hope all of you, if you are in Central Asia, because I know this is more than Kyrgyzstan, are aware of your ancestors and thinking about who they are and what they left for you. Were they good ancestors to you? And what can you learn from what they did that was good for you and what they maybe did that was not? If you're in Kyrgyzstan, you can see your ancestors built roads and electricity infrastructure, hospitals and schools, and they did dramatic things to improve the quality of life in Kyrgyzstan. But some things didn't work out well, and we need to learn from their experiences and what they did. Okay, wrapping up. Hey, I'm doing pretty well. I've got 5 more minutes. No, I'm over time. Yumi, I'm out of time. You didn't.
I know, but that's okay, because it was all of them are important. I'm sorry, students gradually, quietly has been leaving, but I didn't want to say anything because everything was important. So anyway, for you, if you need to leave, yeah, but I would like you to sum up, please, because it's important. Conclusion is always important. Sum up is always important. Please continue.
Is we need to relearn how to think long term. We have a problem because we've been pushing for progress and we've had amazing results with that, but there have been negative side effects. My generation thought we were leaving a better world behind us, and now we understand that we screwed it up. And so on behalf of my generation, I'm sorry. We failed to address the problem, which many of us knew about. But we've got to adapt to this, and you've got to do a better job than we did. Long-term thinking is one important approach to addressing these major civilizational challenges. So what will you do to fight short-term thinking and help make our civilization more sustainable? That's my challenge to you.
Okay.
And thank you very much. Thank you,
so
Yumi, for
much.
this opportunity.
No, thank you so much. And this will be the question that I will probably ask to students to write a reflection paper. And what I would like to do is take a picture of this screen. Just a moment, okay?
Oh,
First, don't please, not, let's do this. Thank you. And yeah, you can not share the screen, but for the students, yeah, now it's, so 11 students are here. Thank you very much. So these students are supposed to be here for this next class. That's why probably they're here. Thank you. But I will stop the recording.
Yeah, I would
Great.
like to know that it was really helpful. And thank you so much for your time and